This is the IBJ podcast for Friday, May 23rd, 2025, brought to you by Taft. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. The week between qualifying for the Indianapolis 500 and the actual race is usually pretty quiet from a news perspective. But there's nothing usual about the last week in this year's month of May. Major penalties assessed to two cars owned by Team Penske, including the car driven by two-time defending champion Josef Newgarden, inflamed long-running concerns about Roger Penske's ownership of both the IndyCar Series and arguably its most successful team. In an extraordinary press conference on Monday, IndyCar President Doug Boles announced that he and another Penske executive decided that harsher penalties were warranted in an effort to protect the integrity of the Indy 500. Their decision, he said, was made without the input of their boss, Roger Penske. 2 days later, Team Penske shocked the industry by announcing that it was parting ways with three of the team's top executives. That included President Tim Cindric, long considered to be Penske's successor in the racing part of his automobile empire. The departures have been widely reported as firings. Now, here's a crucial bit of background. Team Penske also was involved in a controversy early in 2024 involving its cars' turbo boost systems. That resulted in IndyCar revoking Newgarden's victory in the season-opening race. Boles dropped another bombshell late on Wednesday of this week. He revealed that IndyCar has been exploring the creation of an independent governing body beyond Penske's control to officiate the series without the appearance of bias. Now, if you live in the central Indiana media market, these rapid-fire announcements might have been bewildering. You've heard references to cheating and scandal. You've heard that the smoking gun for the qualifying penalties was something called an attenuator that had been illegally modified in some way. You've heard that all of these developments are a very big deal for Penske and therefore the series. If you don't follow IndyCar religiously, this week's podcast gives you the relevant background and serves as a primer on which elements are important. We have a great guest, John Orovitz, a motorsports journalist and author who has covered IndyCar for 3 decades. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast motorsports journalist John Orovitz. John covered IndyCar racing for major media outlets for more than 30 years, about half of that for ESPN. He also is the author of the 2021 book Indy Split, which chronicles the divisive battle between factions in American open-wheel racing that climaxed with an infamous 12-year split that polarized the industry between 1996 and 2007. He also has a book in production right now, due in October, called Class of 99, about kart racing's class of 1999 that had several incredibly influential and popular drivers. John is based in Indianapolis and is joining us via Zoom from Speedway, the home of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. John, thanks for making time today.
Hi, Mason. Indeed, greetings from Speedway, where it's a pretty festive time of year.
So have you been at the track this month? Have you been watching the events of this take place in real time?
I have. I've been out almost every day since oval practice started, and it's a pretty subdued atmosphere in the media center until race weekend. But obviously, things picked up quite a bit in the last few days.
That to me is one of the interesting things about this week. Isn't this week before the 500 typically pretty quiet?
Yeah, once you get through qualifying and the final practice, which was Monday, and we're speaking now on Thursday. These days are an opportunity for people to just basically rest and recharge and get ready for the race weekend, which once you get, especially tomorrow, obviously Carb Day is one of the biggest events of the entire month of May. Once you hit Friday morning, it's nonstop, especially for these drivers when you factor in all the promotional appearances they have to do, the parade, things like that. It's a busy time. So I think in general, this week is a time of solitude and peace and relaxation, but not so much this year.
Yeah, it didn't work out that way. So to give people just a flavor of where we're headed, Quickly tell me how you would rate the events of the last week on a tectonic scale in relation to how much it will affect the IndyCar Series, its drivers, and its fans, with 10 on our scale being the split in the mid-1990s.
Well, all I can say is that I hope it doesn't take years and years to play out like that did. This is what's happened in the scope of, let's extend it to the last 14 months or so, with the what's happened with Team Penske being revealed for abnormalities, illegalities, whatever you call them. It's something that, if this was happening to Dale Coyne Racing or Team Rahal or even Andretti Global, it would be a non-story. Last year's the bit with the manipulating the turbocharger boost, that was a far more serious technical violation. What they've done this year was almost inconsequential in terms of car performance. I think a lot of it was driven by the Penske Corporation's just absolute zeal for perfect appearance. But the bottom line is that the cheating allegation this time is much more clear-cut and obvious. You can literally see it and point it out. You don't need to go to computer traces to understand what was going on. This was them simply modifying a part in such a way that they weren't allowed. And the bigger story than them doing this is actually the fact that it's IndyCar technical inspection a year and a half to see it. This modified part has been in use since the start of the 2024 season, which means these cars have gone through technical inspection at 22 races or something like that, including the 2024 Indianapolis 500, and deemed legal. It was not until this past Sunday morning, in the middle of this, in the second round of qualifying for this year's 500, that suddenly, and you can say IndyCar found it or rival teams told IndyCar that they needed to find it. It doesn't really matter how it got found. It got found. And the consequences are so much greater simply because Team Penske not only is the most successful and historically significant team in IndyCar racing, Roger Penske owns the IndyCar Series. Roger Penske owns the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the Indianapolis 500. So this isn't, Team Smith running an illegal part at the Kansas 200, owned by, Stadium Motorsports. This is a Penske car getting caught running illegal at a Penske track in a Penske series. And, there's an undercurrent of dissatisfaction and mistrust and unhappiness that's been going on. I mean, there's always been an anti-Penske backlash just because they always have been successful and perceived as perfect. Mm-hmm. But it was always assumed that because Penske was held to a higher standard, that they would always be absolutely squeaky clean. And Roger's been pretty clear about this. Roger values his reputation very much. And so the biggest thing that's coming out of this is the fact that it's a Penske scandal. It's Penske, 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 and it's the Penske name that's being dragged through the mud. And you've seen Roger take some pretty decisive action here. The notion of Roger firing Tim Cindric, who's run his race team since 2000, is unthinkable. Right. But with the optics of this situation, it had to happen.
So let me give you my contribution to this conversation, which is all of the easy stuff. And then you can take the wheel for the real story. Just for the few folks out there that don't follow IndyCar religiously, the Indianapolis 500, we're not going to explain that one, is this Sunday, May 25th. For many decades, it has been the largest single-day sporting event in the world. And this year is expected to bring between, 300 and 350,000 people to the Speedway for a day. It is also the most important event on the schedule of what they call the IndyCar Series. There are 17 races this season on the series schedule. A lot of them are either in the Midwest or California. The cars that race in these events are owned by teams. Now, some teams are very well established, have very deep pockets, and can have 3 or 4 cars in each race. And usually each car has a full-time driver. So you have somebody like Josef Newgarden always talking about the number 2 car, which is his car for Team Penske. The most successful team going back about a half a century has been Team Penske. Drivers for Team Penske have won the Indianapolis 500 20 times. The last two Indy 500s, 2023 and 2024, were won by Josef Newgarden, who was a Team Penske driver. The other two Penske drivers in this year's 500 are Will Power, who won the 500 in 2018, and Scott McLaughlin, who's relatively new to IndyCar but already has won several races. So, for the casual fan, John, who is Roger Penske and why is he so important to the IndyCar Series?
Roger Penske is one of the most influential businessmen in America. He has also dedicated his life, both professionally and personally, to auto racing. Mr. Penske he was born in 1937, I want to believe, to a wealthy family in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is the Carmel of Cleveland. He began racing in his 20s, and he was a very, very good amateur and professional driver. He was featured in Sports Illustrated in the days when Sports Illustrated, covered road racing and auto racing. But Penske in the mid-60s chose to focus on business instead of being a race car driver. He bought a Chevrolet dealership in Philadelphia, and one of the requirements was that you have to give up racing for insurance purposes. And oddly enough, he'd been offered a test drive for the Indy 500 that year. And the ride went to a obscure Italian-American immigrant, the kid that nobody had ever heard of by the name of Mario Andretti. So
Whatever happened to
that's one of those interesting sliding doors moments right there.
Yeah.
Anyway, Penske Racing, established in the mid-60s, became America's most successful auto racing team. They started out with a driver named Mark Donohue in sports car racing in the 60s. They were dominant. They entered IndyCar racing for the first time in 1968. Mark Donohue was the 1969 Indy 500 Rookie of the Year. They established their reputation at the Speedway just because of the way their cars were presented. Just immaculate. Chrome wheels, chrome suspension parts, polished. They'd sweep the floor of the garage. The crew all wore the same uniforms. They had neat haircuts and everything. So they really rocked the establishment, just the way they brought in professionalism to racing. Mark Donohue was a college-educated engineer, and the other thing that Penske brought was an engineering-driven focus on racing. So they really pushed the game, and their success is well-deserved. So there's an enormous legacy to this organization. You mentioned earlier, Mason, they've won the Indy 500 20 times. So that's 20 out of 108. So once out of every 5 times or so, Penske has won it. And those have all come since 1972. Mark Donohue took their first win in 1972. So it's a juggernaut. It's a giant. As I alluded to earlier, there's always been a bit of anti-Penske sentiment, just in the sense of jealousy that they've always got the sponsors, they've always got the best drivers, they've always been good. They go through their down patches. They'll have periods where they will go a couple years without winning, but they always come back. And, their last real down period came in the late 1990s, where they didn't win a race from mid-1997 for 3 years. And at the end of 1999, Roger Penske hired an Indianapolis native named Tim Cindric, and he gave him complete control of his IndyCar team, which he'd never done before. There were always managers that had to report to Roger, and now Cindric was being installed as, the de facto boss of the IndyCar team. And they made some technical changes, and they were back to their winning ways. They won championships in 2000, 2001, and things kind of took off from there.
Let me interrupt you just for a second, because this is something I actually know. So Helio Castroneves wins in 2001 and 2002. Gilles de Ferran wins in 2003.
Yes.
Those were all 3 of them are Penske cars. So that was a big difference that Cindric made.
Cindric was the architect that made it all work. They were going to have Greg Moore and Gilles de Ferran as their drivers, but Greg Moore got killed in the last race in 99, and so that's where Castroneves came into the picture. De Ferran retired at the end of 2003, and they've had a variety of drivers since. And obviously, you mentioned the current lineup of Newgarden, Power, and McLaughlin. But yeah, they've, since 2000, they're back to their juggernaut ways. But unfortunately, they've been embroiled in 2 cheating scandals since the start of calendar year 2024. And that's just, Penske's always sailed pretty close to the wind. Every racing team tries to get as close to the rules, the smallest margins possible, and everybody pushes the envelope. There's nothing new in that. There have been times over the years that people believe Penske's gone too far. You can go back to the 60s where they built a 20-foot tall fueling rig, gravity fueling rig, that was an accident waiting to happen. In 1994, when they dominated the kart series, there was talk that they were using traction control, which is a common feature in racing cars these days. But and their cars were torn down, and nothing was found to be amiss. So there's always something going on. There's always an undercurrent of suspicion that because they're so good, they have to be doing something wrong. Well, they've literally gotten caught twice now in the last 14 months or so, and it's just it blew up this week.
Okay, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with the latest episode of the IBJ Podcast. Let's return to my conversation with John Orovitz about the extraordinary events that have transpired in the week before the Indy 500. Let me real quick go back to 2019. What major change happened in 2019 in relation to racing and Roger Penske?
Mr. Penske, at the end of 2019, one morning we woke up in November and we found an email waiting for us that said the Holman George family and Roger Penske are going to announce the sale of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the IndyCar Series, and IMS Productions to Penske Corp in 3 hours. It was stunning. And Penske, I mentioned he was born in 1937. He attended the Indy 500 the first time in 1951. And it made an indelible mark on the man, to the point that, a few weeks before he bought the Speedway or acquired the Speedway, Penske was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom or Medal of Honor or whatever it is. And I would argue that obtaining the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to him is a bigger point of pride or a bigger achievement than winning the Presidential Medal. It's the culmination of everything in his life. But, as you look at potential conflicts of interest as the owner of the series and owner of a team, that's nothing new. Okay? The IRL from 1996 until 2008 or whatever. Honestly, until the Holmans sold the Speedway and the IndyCar Series, which they were operating, the Holmans were operating the IndyCar Series. You had Vision Racing and Ed Carpenter Racing. These are Tony George founded, and Tony still maintains a presence with Ed Carpenter's team because he's a stepfather or adopted father. But so honestly, since 1996, if you went over to the kart series at that time, Gerald Forsyth and Kevin Kalkoven, who owned the series, were operating teams that competed in the series. But none of them ever got caught cheating, And again, none of them, with all due respect to even Gerald Forsyth's team, which won the championship and many races in kart over the years, none of these organizations are Penske Racing, or on a broader sense, Penske Corporation. Roger Penske is the world's largest car salesman. He's got 60, 70,000 employees around the world. If here in Indianapolis, you see Penske Chevrolet, you see Penske Honda. There's Penske dealers literally around the world. The biggest Ferrari dealer in London, Roger Penske. It goes on and on and on and on. You cannot explain the spread and the reach of this guy.
From what I remember of 2019, the other team owners were very concerned about that inherent conflict of interest in Penske owning the series, owning the signature racetrack, while also owning one of his most successful teams. But in the end, everybody was pretty okay with it because I think tell me, I mean, the general feeling was that we like that this guy who obviously loved racing and has more money than Midas wants to come in and try to improve things.
Well, it's probably twofold. The first is what I was just saying. Literally since the 90s, the owner of the series had been operating a team in either series, so it was a pretty established practice, and it certainly was viewed as a conflict of interest. But again, I think it was because those teams didn't have the magnitude and the reputation of Penske. Oh, the other aspect of it was the sense that it was just a good thing for the speedway and for the sport to have a new steward. And that's the term that both Tony and Roger used when talking about, stewardship, whether it was the speedway, the Indy 500, or the series. I think it was viewed that it was kind of going into safe hands, but the biggest concern at the time was that separation of church and state between Penske, the competitor, and Penske, the owner of the series. And I don't think they worried about that as significantly with these other teams. But now, obviously, it's, the excrement has hit the ventilator.
So yeah, those concerns were inflamed early in 2024, as you referenced earlier, when it was discovered that the Team Penske cars of Newgarden, McLaughlin, and Power had the ability to access a speed boost at times when other drivers did not. They call that system push to pass, and you can probably explain it better than I can. And I think you mentioned earlier, I mean, you think that of two infractions that we're talking about, that was probably the more egregious.
They are given 200 seconds is the typical number per race, where they can push this button and it gives them a boost of horsepower that in theory lets them help pass another car. It's a video game-like thing, I have to say. The system is controlled by electronics operated by the racing series. And somehow it transpired in early 2024. It's probably too complicated to go into. The cars are, even though they're basically 15-year-old cars, they are constantly evolving. They added a hybrid system, energy recovery system to the engines that was in development throughout 2022 and 2023. And it was finally put into effect in 2024. Penske claims that some computer code that was used during the hybrid testing was incorrectly looked in the cars that allowed the hybrid system or the push-to-pass system that operated the turbocharging boost to function when it shouldn't have been, when it should have been turned off by the series electronics. Well, they were running a warm-up practice at Long Beach, the second race of 2024, and some people noticed that during this practice session that the Penske cars were using push-to-pass, which theoretically should not have been activated at that time. So an investigation was made. They figured out that, yes, it was functioning in their cars. They figured out that they went back and looked and said, yes, Newgarden used it during the race at St. Pete, the first race of the season, which he won, making a pass that looked like it could have involved, extra turbo boost. IndyCar took away Newgarden's win. The really egregious thing was, like I said, Cindric said they left some code in the computer that they shouldn't have. Newgarden said, the rules were different because our last race was an exhibition race, and I thought I was just still in that same headspace. That's inexcusable for a driver at his level to say that. I mean, you look at baseball and all the guys that said, I used steroids, I put my hand up, I apologize. They've been welcomed back into the fold, whereas the Barry Bonds and the Roger Clemens, this is Newgarden. This is like Bonds and Clemens saying, oh, no, it's not my fault, So I think his reputation took a hit bigger than Penske's from that episode, to be honest. Because the Cindric explanation of incorrect code was far more plausible than Newgarden's. And McLaughlin, to his credit, he's the one guy that put his hand up and said, yeah, I used it. It was, it was a reflexive action. When I realized it was on and it shouldn't have been, I got off of it, and it was proven that he was only on it for like 1.4 seconds or something. And so McLaughlin came out with a clean reputation. And the drivers should not in any way be, for this latest thing, which let's just talk about what it was. There's a thing on the back of the car called an attenuator. It's about the size of a 12-pack of soda. In early 2024, IndyCar mandated that it be strengthened slightly by putting a small plate on the outside of it. The parts were sent back to Dallara to be modified and returned to the teams. When the parts came back, Penske didn't like the way this seam met up on the attenuator. So what they did is they kind of filled it in, just like putting a piece of tape or filling in the gap between the doors in your car, something like that. That was flat illegal. It probably had an infinitesimal, there was probably thought that yes, it could provide a performance gain because it did make the piece more aerodynamic, but it's not a major aerodynamic piece. Its function is safety. And I'm convinced that the modification was done as much for appearance, given Penske's just zealotry for perfection, as it was for a performance gain. But the fact of the matter, the indisputable fact of the matter is that it's black and white in the rule book. You cannot modify that part. And to confuse the story more, if you want to do that, Penske did this modification to all of those attenuators that it had in its stock. So yes, the car that Newgarden won the 2024 Indy 500 with, the car that is on display in the IMS museum, features the illegal part. And the reason that when McLaughlin crashed his car before qualifying this year, he didn't get penalized for this because they went and they looked at his crashed car, which had been declared legal Saturday along with the other Penske cars, and they found that McLaughlin's car had a legal piece on it. And the reason is that all of the new stock that Penske had received of the attenuator from Dallara had improved their quality control, and the seam was now apparently good enough for Penske material. And so that it was not modified on the car that McLaughlin was driving. So who knows? Maybe that caused his crash. Let's get, conspiratorial.
There you go. I want to go back and just explain to folks how this played out because it was confusing even in the moment. So
it still is. I mean, that's why we're talking about it.
So their qualifications started for this year's Indy 500. So on the first round of qualifications on Saturday, Newgarden and Power were among the 12 fastest cars. And thus
with McLaughlin, all three of them were.
Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah. And thus would enter the next round on Sunday to determine where those 12 would show up.
And they all passed tech on Saturday.
Right, they all passed tech. While the cars were being inspected before qualifying on Sunday for the Fast 12 qualification, inspectors noticed on Power and Newgarden's car that the attenuator had been slightly modified, that it had the fill in the gap stuff was there.
Yep.
So they flagged Power and McLaughlin, Power and Newgarden, but not McLaughlin.
Yeah, McLaughlin crashed in the morning, so he wasn't going to take place in qualifying.
Oh, that's right. So he already was relegated to the 12th spot because he couldn't participate.
He was going to be 12th if things unfolded normally.
Right. All right. So the two other cars, they've been flagged. And so the punishment, the penalty for modifying the attenuators for Newgarden and Power's car was to automatically move them to the 11th and 12th spots. So McLaughlin actually moves up to 10th.
To drop them to the bottom of the session that they were disqualified from, which was Fast 12.
Yeah, so right. But overnight, Sunday to Monday, Doug Boles, president of IndyCar, and Mark Miles, CEO of Penske Entertainment, decided that this merited a harsher penalty. And they were motivated, I understand, by a need to ensure that the integrity of the race wasn't questioned.
Yeah, it's optics. You're going to hear that word about this over and over again. It was just the look of Penske cheating, Penske at Penske, blah, blah, blah. They did decide that, this isn't the Long Beach Grand Prix or the Iowa 250. This is the Indianapolis 500, and therefore just being pushed from where they may have potentially qualified, which could have been on the front row. They followed the rule book, put them to 12th, and then they decided, well, the rule book also says we have the discretion to make it a change when we deem it necessary. And they used the sanctity of the Indy 500 and integrity and things like that. And I think they did the right thing. I mean, clearly, I think certainly if you polled the public right now, you'd get people strongly in favor of saying, yeah, at the least, those guys should have been put to the back of the Indy 500 field, not the back of the Fast 12. And that's what they did.
Yeah. So they're 32nd and 33rd right now in a field of 33.
Correct.
Now, IndyCar also, as part of their penalty, suspended Tim Cindric and Ron Rzuski for the Indy 500. And the teams for those two cars were fined $100,000 each. And so all this was announced on Monday.
And that is a penalty that came down from IndyCar, from Penske Entertainment, towards members of Team Penske.
That to me was one of the most interesting things about that press conference with Doug Boles on Monday, where he explained that he and Mark Miles, essentially early in the morning or overnight, decided that there needed to be a harsher penalty, and that they decided what they decided without consulting Roger Penske in any way, except at the very end of it to tell him, hey, this is coming. We're moving your cars back and we're assessing these penalties.
That's got to be a tough call to make, because on the one hand, if Roger Penske is the figurehead of Penske Entertainment and Penske Entertainment is coming up with this fine, shouldn't he be involved? Well, wait a minute. We're penalizing Team Penske, which is Roger Penske. And that's this whole conflict of interest ugliness rearing its ugly head. That's why it's all blown up the way it has.
Right. Then on Wednesday, Team Penske announced that it was, I think that the way that they initially
that is a Roger Penske move. That is Roger Penske making that move.
Right. And I think the announcement said they were parting ways with Tim Cindric and IndyCar managing director, Ron Rzuski, I guess IndyCar managing director. Is that just for Team Penske?
Yeah.
And general manager Kyle Moyer. Are those three guys the strategists for their respective drivers also?
Yes.
Right, which is a huge deal for the driver. You've got somebody in your ear during the race that you have a relationship with that's telling you about, where you need to be, what's around you, what's happening with your tires. You have conversations about strategy in the moment. And so now these drivers are going to have somebody else in their ear. I'm sure somebody else that they know. But I think that's also a disadvantage. But to the bigger point.
So let me just interrupt quickly. But Cindric has been Newgarden's strategist for years. And Newgarden won last year's 500 with a substitute strategist because Cindric was suspended for last year's race because of the St. Pete turbo violation.
Right.
So there's a precedent. It's not that big a deal. There's, Penske's all good people. They've all worked with each other. It's not going to be ideal. It's not going to be perfect, but it's not that much of a step down.
Right. But I want to go back to what you said about how, this is a Roger Penske move. Didn't have to do it, but he decided that he needed to.
Well, I think I don't know how much Mr. Penske listens to the media or puts his finger on the pulse of the public, but I think it's something that had to happen, for the integrity of his team, much less the sport. It's unfathomable that Cindric is gone. Just because I think there was a feeling that, if there was a succession plan for Team Penske, it was going to be Cindric racing, not Jay Penske racing or Greg Penske racing. So this is a major shock. I mean, Cindric was, he was the future.
Mm.
So this is, in terms of the effect that this is having on Penske, the racing team, this is seismic. Not so much in terms of getting through this Sunday's Indy 500 with 3 different strategists on the cars. They got to build a whole new org chart.
Right. And there are, more than 10 races left just in the season, including one right after the Indy 500.
Yeah, it's relentless the way IndyCar, because of their fear of going up against the NFL in the fall, the fact that they end their season on Labor Day. Their summer is just it's a brutal schedule with maybe 3 or 4. It's not NASCAR, which doesn't have a week off until Thanksgiving, but it's much more difficult to prepare Indy cars, especially when there's changeover between oval tracks and road racing tracks. It's not just like NASCAR where you go back and pull another car off the shelf and take that one to Darlington instead of the race you were at last week. With IndyCar, they tear the cars down. It's a brutal schedule from here on out. And I would think that to, have to build a whole new management team mid-season, that's a pretty daunting task.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll mostly come from within, but my goodness.
I want to mention what Roger Penske himself said in his statement. He said, quote, "Nothing is more important than the integrity of our sport and our race teams. We have had organizational failures during the last 2 years, and we had to make necessary changes. I apologize to our fans, our partners, and our organization for letting them down." To what you said, to take the guy who I think everybody assumed, probably also Roger Penske, who would take this, into a next generation of racing. What a difficult decision.
I think it was probably one of the most difficult decisions Mr. Penske's ever had to make. It's not like firing Kevin Kogan in 1982. This is the guy that he trusted with his baby. If Roger Penske's always called racing his golf game or his, fishing weekend or whatever, his business is business, but he's also the most successful man in the business of racing. And, when he brought Cindric on in late 99, the Penske, he has a NASCAR team. He's had sports car teams over the years and everything, but the IndyCar team, that's his baby with the Indy 500 and everything. That's the one that means the most to him. So when he ceded control of that to Cindric 25 years ago, that was huge. That was one of the, for a guy that likes control as much as Penske, that is one of the biggest handoffs of control, that he's ever done. And then, like I said, Cindric's been in charge of NASCAR since 2005, and they've had sports car programs with Porsche and then Acura, and now again with Porsche. They're the factory Porsche sports car team in the IMSA series here in the U.S. and in the FIA World Sports Car Championship. So, replacing Rzuski and Kyle Moyer, that's obviously a big impact on the IndyCar team. But until last year, when Cindric stepped back a little to spend more time with his family, I think he's 58, 59 years old, he was fully in charge of NASCAR and the sports car team as well. So it's enormous shoes to fill. And I don't think you can just point a finger. I mean, Cindric has to go just because he was the boss of the team and everything. But this is a pretty huge organization, and it's a bit of a stretch to blame him directly for it. But in the optics of the situation, he had to go.
Doesn't Penske still have the problem, though, of optics, of at least the appearance of conflict of interest, because he still owns his team, he still owns the IndyCar Series, and he still owns the Speedway?
Yeah, now the story's coming out that now they're saying that they've been talking for 6 months about establishing some kind of independent authority to govern the series. Whereas I haven't been chasing that story just because a lot of my focus is on IMSA and sports car racing these days. But Marshall Pruitt, one of the top journalists in IndyCar, has been getting stonewalled on that question for months. And today or yesterday, it's like, oh, for 6 months we've been discussing it. There's got to be a big revamp of their whole technical procedure and staffing. It's got to happen. Too many people have been there for too long.
So what Doug said during the press conference where he was talking about this was, we have been working very, very hard to create an entity, an officiating entity. And by officiating, I mean race control and tech inspection, and an entity that is completely removed from anything that has to do with Penske Entertainment or Roger Penske or the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in the IndyCar Series. Do you think that would do the trick?
There's always going to be controversy about rules violations. But in this case, if it's not one branch of the Penske Corporation observing, penalizing, officiating another branch of the Penske Corporation, it's definitely going to help. It's definitely going to help the optics of the entire situation moving forward. But the key is that the focus is going to be on what already happened. And so the challenge for everyone involved right now is just to get out of the stigma of all of this.
How do you think this will affect Roger Penske's legacy, if at all?
Well, it's never good when, at any stage in your life, when you make headlines for the wrong reasons. And this is one of those things that, especially because it's come so late in Mr. Penske's life, it's if and when he passes away. And I mean, the guy, he could live forever based on the way he's lived his life, working 22-hour days. People are going to remember this. They're going to say, Penske Racing was one of the greatest teams of all time. But, later in his life, admittedly, after he ceded, day-to-day control of it, it got its hand caught in the cookie jar.
I know you've got to go here in a few minutes, but I wanted to switch gears just a little bit and ask about the new broadcasting partner. Fox Sports has been broadcasting this season. I think it's a deal for several seasons. I think ratings have been pretty good in general. Some races are up over last year, some are a little bit down. I think overall, it's a 15%-ish improvement. I think they really feel like they needed to have a great Indy 500 from a viewership perspective. Does all of this stuff help? I mean, when I took a look online and when I was researching for the podcast, I mean, there are news outlets that are reporting on this that would never touch a story about IndyCar before. This is this going to be a situation where any publicity is good publicity? Is this going to help?
They're counting on this Fox deal big time, just because they need it to boost the economics for the teams to get sponsorship. The numbers they're delivering so far, I don't think are staggeringly great. The Long Beach audience was embarrassing. And they can blame going up the Masters and everything all they want. The truth of the matter is their core audience outside of Indiana or I-465 is tiny. I'm not certain they're going to get it. Maybe this will help, maybe it won't. But I wish it was back in the days where they were getting excited about getting an 8.5 instead of a 4.5, put it that way. Their historical numbers are, yes, they're up in the short term, but over where they were a long time ago or compared to NASCAR. And the most alarming thing is that on a recent race weekend, 5 forms of racing raced. IndyCar ranked 4th. So yeah, they've got a serious challenge when it comes to their ratings. They need a home run on Sunday, and only time will tell whether they get it.
All right. Are you covering the race?
Oh yeah, I'll be out there. I've been doing stuff for Motorsport magazine out of England. I do a monthly column for them, and I'm actually doing the race coverage for Autosport magazine, which is a Bible among racing fans.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know you got to go, but best of luck to you this weekend. It's going to be something.
Yeah, it's always special to be out there on race day. And I got to tell you, the whole reason I moved to where I live is so that I can enjoy the 500 atmosphere and actually, have a good time on Saturday night and not have to get up and get in there at 4:00 in the morning. I can roll out of bed at 8:30 in the morning and be in the media center at 9.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate your time, and I'll let you get back to work.
Great. Thanks for the time.
My thanks again to John Orovitz. Again, his book, Class of 99, is expected to debut in October. And before you get on with your Memorial Day weekend, there are a few stories in the latest IBJ I want to draw to your attention. First up, Washington Square Mall was one of Indy's premier shopping centers in the 1990s, but it's now a shell of its former self and missing its retail anchor stores. Taylor Wooten reports on 2 plans to revive the mall that might be mutually exclusive. Also in this week's issue, Dave Lindquist takes us behind the scenes as Fox Sports pulls out the stops to broadcast its first Indy 500. And Daniel Bradley explains how businesses in Westfield are preparing to outlast the effects of construction on State Road 32. And again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. I will say it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest local business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. We're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months, just to get a sense of how valuable and original our content is. Just go to ibj.com.
Get ready for full throttle coverage as we shift into high gear for Business at the Brickyard, presented by Liuna with support from the City of Westfield and Daniel's Family Vineyard and Winery. We're giving you the inside track on the powerful connection between motorsports and the Indiana economy. Join us at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for exclusive interviews, behind-the-scenes access, and the stories that drive the business of motorsports. So buckle up and join us for Emmy Award-winning Business at the Brickyard coverage all month long.
And click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll see you again on June the 2nd.